All right, guys, so tonight we're going to be taking some C notes. Since we are starting the osmosis and diffusion section of our PBL, we are going to have to talk about the cell membrane. The cell membrane, hands down, is the most important organelle of all cells, eukaryotic and prokaryotic, that have to deal with the transportation and movement of particles in and out of a cell. So here's a real picture of a cell membrane from an electron microscope. This is what led scientists to believe that the cell membrane was actually composed of two distinct layers. So keep in mind that all organisms, whether you're considered to have a trillion cells like a human or just one cell like an amoeba and a paramecium, all organisms are made up of cells, and all cells have a cell membrane. It is flexible and it does allow things to move. Now, keep in mind, if your whole organism is one cell, it does still have to move, whether it has a flagella, the cilia, or it uses a pseudopod, which is a foot. Cells are always constantly moving. So let's talk about homeostasis. I cannot stress how important this is. This is one of those vocabulary terms that you are just going to have to know. Homeostasis is the balance of internal conditions. Mainly in this aspect, we're just going to be talking about cells, but just know that there is also homeostasis within the human body and things like that. So we're definitely going to build upon this concept. So for right now, I just want you to know it's when things get to an equilibrium. Wow, there we go. An equilibrium, which means they are balanced. So if you have to think of one word when you think of homeostasis, I want you to think of balance. Okay? It's where your internal conditions are going to be balanced to the way they want from the external conditions. So homeostasis is maintained by the plasma membrane because it is what controls what enters and leaves the cell. It is what we call the gateway, after all. So let's get into the other functions. We know that the plasma membrane is that protective barrier for some kingdoms, like the animal kingdom. It's the only protective barrier they have. But here's a new function. It regulates transport. It regulates what comes in and out of the cell. And so we call that selectively permeable. Now, if you break that word down, it makes complete sense. Permeable means things can move in and out. And selectively means that some things can move in and out, while others cannot. So cell membranes, or plasma membrane, how we're going to start talking them in this upper vocabulary, are semipermeable or selectively permeable. Just know that they mean the same thing, that they do regulate what goes in and out of the cell, which can also play a role in that homeostasis. They also allow cells to identify themselves so that that the body can know that yes, it is supposed to be there, or no, it is an invader. And they can also provide an anchoring site for filaments of the cytoplasm and also for things to connect. They provide a binding site for enzymes. We've already covered enzymes and we know how important they are. And they can also, those binding sites and filaments can allow for interlocking surfaces, and so they can join together. This is also what can contain the cytoplasm and the fluid of the cell. In that video I showed you of the animation from Harvard, you could see how they actually had a plasma membrane around waste, and then that transporter protein was taking it to the edge of the cell to be discarded. So they are very fluid in their motion. So here is the structure of a cell membrane, and we're going to go into all the details. But first thing I want you to notice is it's called a lipid bilayer. Bilayer because, again, like from that picture of the electron microscope, we can see that there are two distinct layers, right? It's like a sandwich, if you will, with two pieces of bread. These are actually made up of lipids, which is one of the 4 macromolecules that we discussed, known as fats. And if you remember, these are actually called phospholipids. And remember, a phospholipid has that phosphate head with the fatty acid tails. And if you remember from that, we talked about the difference between the heads and the tails and how one was water-fearing and the other was water-loving. You also have different types of proteins that are embedded in another macromolecule, as well as a carbohydrate. So if you think about it, all 3 out of the 4 macromolecules that we've discussed are all located inside the cellular membrane or the plasma membrane. So let's actually go and break down the job of each component of the cell membrane. So we have these little phospholipids, right? This is actually the number one main component of a cell membrane. And if y'all remember, we talked about how the heads are hydrophilic, which means they attract water, and the tails are hydrophobic, which means they repel water. So they actually form in this lipid bilayer as a way to protect these fatty acids, which hate water. So they form so these two are protected, where the hydrophilic heads that are going to be exposed to water are on the outside. Then you have your cholesterol, which is also another type of lipid, but these are the cholesterol functions. So cholesterol is actually very beneficial because it does help the plasma membrane to remain fluid. It stops all the phospholipids from sticking together and becoming very rigid. It can also add to the structural support of the cell by allowing the cell membrane to hold its shape. Then you have proteins. And of course, when we talk about proteins and then therefore enzymes and everything, we know that proteins have many, many functions. Even within a plasma membrane, there are multiple functions. So we have what we have called the peripheral proteins, which are not going to actually go all the way through the plasma membrane. And then you have the integral proteins, which do. So let's talk about the difference, okay? The peripheral proteins are pretty much going to be on the outside, and they attach to the integral proteins, and they're used for cellular communication. So right here they're showing you that the cytoskeleton is attached to it. We know the cytoskeleton helps provide shape, but it also can transport things in and out of the cell. So these are like your relay. They pretty much like the soldiers on the front lines, right? If they see something, they alert the others. The peripheral proteins are there for the communication. The integral proteins, which are the ones that go all the way through, these are vital to that homeostasis and that semipermeable, because these are the proteins that allow passage of specific materials into and out of the cell. And as we get into that, we're going to talk about the different types of transport, passive and active, but just know that both are involved in this integral protein. And then the last one is a carbohydrate. These are actually long chains of a polysaccharide, right, which are many saccharides put together. And the carbohydrates help a cell to identify itself, and they can also act as a binding site to allow certain cells to stick together, or, if that white blood cell is coming around and it bumps into one, it can read that carbohydrate and know that that cell is supposed to be there and it's not an invader. Here's just another picture of the plasma membrane. I just want you to see that they can come in many different illustrations, but the components are always going to be the same. You're always going to have the phospholipids in that bilayer protecting those fatty acids, cholesterol moved out through them, the integral proteins, the peripheral proteins, and the carbohydrates on the outside. So let's go, I'm going to go fast through the phospholipids because they should be review. Remember that it is actually made up of the monomer of a lipid, which is the fatty acid. And so we have 2 fatty acid tails and then a phosphohead. The phosphohead is polar, which means it does like water. And then the fatty acids are nonpolar, which means they do not like water. They do not have a charge. So this is what makes up the cell membrane. The phosphohead is made up of that glycerol and that phosphate group together. So let's talk about, you're going to hear the word fluid mosaic model. Well, what does that actually mean? Fluid is the reason why we call a cell membrane fluid is because these phospholipids and proteins can actually move in and out and wherever they would like to within the cell membrane, like a liquid. And so that's why we call it fluid. So this transport protein could actually slide over here and replace where the cholesterol is, and the cholesterol could move up to the top if it needs to. So it's not set in stone. It's constantly changing, constantly moving, adapting to whatever function it needs. And then the mosaic is because of the pattern that it looks like it produces from the scattered proteins that you can see from the top of the cell. It's kind of just at these random places, and so that's why it's called mosaic. As you can kind of see these little proteins with the carbohydrates popping up on the outside. So fluid mosaic. So the polar heads, like we said, are hydrophilic, which means they're water-loving, and the tails are non-polar and they're water-fearing. Just know, like polar, hydrophilic, water-loving, non-polar, hydrophobic, water-fearing. Those three go together. And so this is what makes the membrane selective. This is what makes the membrane semi-permeable. Because things that are actually water-fearing as well, they do not need a transport protein to go through. If they are small enough, they can just pop right through this fluid bilipid membrane. But if they are water-loving, these tails are going to repel them and not allow them to go through. So it's actually the water-fearing part of the phospholipid, which is what makes it selective. Here's just another picture showing you kind of breaking it down from that sandwich part, right? It's like you have the crust and then you have the nice soft part of the bread inside of our sandwich analogy. So the cell membrane, like we said, is made up of two layers, and that's why we call it a bilayer. So you have the one layer that's going to face the external part of the cell, and then the other bilayer that faces the internal part of the cell. So this picture is just trying to show you how hydrophobic molecules can go freely in and out if they are small enough, where hydrophilic molecules are actually going to be repelled. Now, the picture looks like they're being repelled by the heads, but really it's just they're trying to go past it, and the moment they get in that zone, they bounce back. It's almost like if you were trying to touch an electric fence, your reaction is to pull your hand back as quick as you can. So let's talk about solubility. Materials that are soluble, which means they can be broken down and apart into their components, things that are soluble in lipids can pass through the cell membrane easily. Small molecules and larger hydrophobic molecules move through it easily, such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water. Ions, hydrophilic molecules larger than water, and large molecules such as proteins do not move through the membrane on their own. So they actually have to use those proteins for support. Now notice you're like, what? You said water? I'll go back right here. So what I mean is how water can go through. Water is still obviously repels hydrophobic things. But what you can't actually see here are there tiny little proteins, which we can almost call like a water pore or a protein pore, which allows water to freely move in and out. So yes, water is very small. And so it can still what we consider to move freely through the phospholipid bilayer. However, it doesn't take one of these large proteins to go through. It's what is called almost like a channel instead of having to require energy because it is a passive movement. So like I said, the ions, the large hydrophilic molecules, anything that's bigger than water are going to need the proteins to move through, and they can't move through on their own. So this is where we're going to stop. That we'll do a separate video on the types of transport, and I'll see you tomorrow in class.